Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 415. And now that we've added everyone to the chat, I'd like to talk about this record from 1969, released on Milestone. It's by Gary Bartz, Another Earth. What I have is a 1969 American pressing. Whether or not it's a first pressing is a bit of arcania. I'm not really fit to judge. There are 4 different labels from 1969. In any event, it was only reissued once after this in the 1970s until the very recent 2024 Vinyl Me Please release. Gary Bartz is a remarkable musician. At roughly 85, give or take, he's still gigging away as I make this video. He's won 2 Grammys. His career spans 70 years. He's made 45 records as a leader. He's made records with hard bop pioneers, Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, with those funk meisters, the Mizell brothers, with Miles Davis, and with members of A Tribe Called Quest. That's how broad his span is. He also, and he's not alone in this, hates the word jazz due to its derogatory origins, and in honor of him I won't use the J word for the rest of this video. It's not really possible to characterize Gary Bartz as belonging to any one style given the whole span of his career. It only makes sense, I think, to talk about his music in terms of the particular point of evolution. And this record is a great snapshot not only of his first years as a leader, but also of his approach to albums as earbooks. I last talked about a Gary Bartz record on this channel about 4 years ago, actually, and in that review I went over the high points of his biography, but I'd like to linger more on his development in the 1960s here. Just to recap, he was born in Baltimore in 1940. Some of his earliest musical influences included the playing of Charlie Parker. He began playing saxophone at age 11, and his dad, who was quite tapped into the local music scene, took him around to local clubs and listening to Monday afternoon jam sessions and wherever he could get 11, 12, 13-year-old in to listen to music. At 14 years of age on one of these occasions, he gets up onto the bandstand with Sonny Stitt, who decides to test the young man and plays in all kinds of different keys, and Bartz absolutely followed him. He did similarly well around the same time when his dad took him to the Club Casino in Baltimore, where Max Roach was playing. His dad had kind of orchestrated it so that young Gary would be able to get up on the bandstand, and Roach humored him, tested him with all kinds of Charlie Parker tunes, and the young man pulled it off. And he does this again at 14, maybe 15 years of age. And Roach says, "Look, when it comes time to come to New York, give me a call." And that moment came soon enough. At age 17, he was off to New York to study at Juilliard, and Max Roach and his wife Abby Lincoln looked out for the young man on the Manhattan music scene. A couple of years later, in 1960, Bartz's parents opened a nightclub in Baltimore, and he begins to shuttle back and forth between the two cities, playing at the club but also still studying at Juilliard. His first serious professional forays begin after he graduates in his early 20s, and his learning curve steepened rapidly when he joined Charles Mingus's J-Word workshop. There he traded ideas with people like Eric Dolphy, McCoy Tyner, and Rahsaan Roland Kirk, and he also became part of the Manhattan loft scene, not the one 10 years later which produced disco, but the one in the early 1960s which involved communal living and woodshedding. While still with a foot in Mingus's world, he spent lots of time loft hopping with his friend, the trombonist Gratian Monker. Together they dug into the music of Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane, and Bartz also kept in touch musically and otherwise with Max Roach. And for the politically conscious young man, both Mingus and Roach were extremely influential. Bartz says in retrospect, when he thinks about himself in the 1960s, he was feeling at the time the world didn't need another musician, they needed somebody who could fight this system. But what he learned from observing Roach and observing Mingus was that you could fight the system using music. In pure musical terms, Bartz achieves greater prominence when he joins Art Blakey and the J-Word Messengers in 1965, after John Gilmore had quit the band. He joins a lineup which includes Lee Morgan on trumpet and John Hicks on piano, and it also leads to his debut on vinyl on the Limelight record Soulfinger. With Art Blakey, his learning curve steepened even more. He was expected to know the band's whole repertoire effectively the moment he joined. Luckily he did. There were also times when the band would debut a song he'd never even heard, let alone practiced, and he would have to learn it live on the bandstand. However, despite his inclusion in what is clearly the preeminent hard bop group of all time, and despite what he was learning about band leading from Blakey, his direction was in an altogether different direction at this time. It was in a much more avant-garde and a much more political direction, which was not the thing of the Messengers, and so he didn't end up staying very long. He begins blazing his own trail in 1966 and 1967, and he becomes fascinated with the idea of individual songs as short stories or as chapters, and of a record as a full work, or as he termed it, an earbook. In other words, he was talking about concept albums, and Bartz wanted to explore this possibility in his own music. On the strength of the 2 Limelight records that he'd recorded while with Blakey and the J-Word Messengers, the second is called Hold On I'm Coming, he was signed by Orrin Keepnews to a Milestone contract, and he makes his debut as a leader in 1967 with the record Libra. Libra is a good record, although even by Bartz's own account, it stops short of this whole concept of being an earbook or kind of a musical novel. It's more, as he would say, a collection of short stories. He'd been reading about how Beethoven would alternate light compositions with heavier compositions, more intense compositions, and having done this lighter collection of compositions in Libra, he now began to focus on doing something more substantial, more of an earbook, more of a novel. This record was made over 2 separate days, June 19th and June 25th, 1968, at Plaza Sound in New York. Orrin Keepnews is the producer and George Sawtell is the engineer. These are all Bartz compositions inspired by, of all things, his own UFO sightings. Bartz had, according to his own account, first seen a UFO in 1963 when he'd seen an object in the sky moving in a figure-8 pattern. He'd subsequently bought a telescope and he made another sighting. As he thought about these sightings, he began to think how incongruous it was to use the term alien to describe other life forms when all life existed theoretically in the same universe, and thinking about the nature of life in the universe led him to compose the title track for this record, Another Earth. He was conscious while writing it of how ambitious this was, but he still ends up with a piece which contains 6 different themes, which when recorded was 24 minutes long, absolutely the limit of what an LP can hold. The lineup for this record is truly impressive. On the first side, it's a sextet, with Bartz on alto, Charles Tolliver on trumpet, and Pharoah Sanders on tenor sax. Pharoah and Bartz had become quite friendly, and they'd been experimenting too, at times going and standing next to the West Side Highway and playing their saxophones as loud as they could, trying to attract the attention of drivers, which they never could, which is a tad surprising if you've ever heard Karma. The rhythm section on this record includes Stanley Cowell on piano, Reggie Workman on bass, and Freddie Waits on drums. And on side 2, it's a quartet with those 3 and Bartz. Side 1 is entirely composed of the track Another Earth, which has 6 distinct movements, although I confess to never actually having counted them before I read up on Bartz's thoughts about the record. It starts as a cheerful journey. You've got Bartz's expressive alto, Tolliver comes in for a while, then Pharoah emerges from the mix with some characteristically enthusiastic overblowing, to which Bartz replies in his own personality. There's no need, I think, for a play-by-play through this whole thing. The whole piece has many moods. It's certainly out at certain points, far out, but there are also some grand statements and a lot of moments of real beauty. It's also a pleasure to hear this particular group together when you consider how influential Cowell, Tolliver, and Sanders would all be in their own right. On side 2, we're now in a quartet setting, and it begins with Dark Nebula, which has an almost Middle Eastern sounding head arrangement. It's beautiful stuff. It really does feature Bartz, and it's a riveting track. UFO is Bartz showing his roots. It's really a swinging little bop number for him to blow over. And that's followed by Lost in the Stars, which is a gorgeous duet. It's Bartz accompanied just by Workman. It's beautiful stuff. The final track, Perihelion and Aphelion, seems to roll all of the moods of the record into one. Bartz himself seems to get about 10 different moods out of his saxophone on this. There are foghorn-like honks, there are sheets of sound, there are Parker-esque runs, all having this kind of restless energy which flows all the way through this record. And Cowell, incidentally, shines on here both as a soloist and in his accompaniment. This is a record on which Gary Bartz, to me, sounds like a young man bursting with things that he wants to show us and have us hear, and he's only got 45 minutes to do it. If that sounds like a criticism it's not meant to be, I think this is really a masterclass in post-Coltrane progressive saxophone. By that I mean he's inherited a vocabulary from Coltrane, from Dolphy, from Pharoah and others, but he's no imitator. It's 1968, and there's a restlessness and an immediacy to his music which would play out in 2 Troop records very shortly. Bartz's future would have him exploring more politically aware music. This isn't that yet. It's something quite different. It got more of an outer space focus, but like all albums made, when an artist is in a period of rapid change, it's fascinating. And for me, this is 4.5 out of 5 stars.